Our next speaker is Dan Kuebler. He's the Dean of the School of Natural and Applied Sciences here at Franciscan University. He is also a professor of biology and is responsible for teaching courses in evolution, cell biology, evolution, cell biology, and science and faith. His biological research involves studying adult stem cells in bone marrow and adipose tissue for use in orthopedic treatments. He is the co-author of a book entitled The Evolution Controversy, a survey of competing theories, published by Baker Academic, and it's a marvelous book, which is a scientific critique of the various theories of evolutionary thought, and is currently working on a book examining the integration of Catholic teaching and evolution. He has presented and published academic papers regarding evolution and faith, and has authored a variety of popular articles on science, evolution, and religion. He is going to speak about evidence for evolution and why it matters for Catholics.
Well, Steve, thank you for that introduction. And so we have a little transition here in the program. So myself and the next speaker, the two biologists that will be talking. So it's after we've gotten sort of that philosophical and theological foundation for this discussion, I'm going to try to hit on a little biology here. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation, it says evidence for evolution and why it matters for Catholics. So I don't want to spend an hour going over different scientific evidence for evolution, but I do want to hit on that. But I'm going to sort of reverse the talk from the title, and first talk why it matters for Catholics to grapple with the evidence for evolution and to examine it critically. And then go into, I think, three pieces of evidence that I think are interesting, the things that sort of emerged recently in evolutionary research that sort of dispel some concerns that a lot of Catholics or Christians often have with evolution, or critiques that they might have, and try to address those. So there is a natural synergy that exists between a Catholic worldview and scientific discovery, right? So from a Catholic perspective, we see the world as a handiwork of God, who is reason itself, and the rational order and structure inherent in creation point towards its ultimate source, in God. That's a distinctly Catholic notion, right? And the Church has long maintained that reading the book of creation through an investigation of the natural world can reveal something about the Creator, just like examining a work of art can reveal something about the artist and the artist's intentions and that, right? Likewise, the fact that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, that we share in that rationality, actually gives us hope that we can, comprehend some of the mysteries of His created world. That we may not fully understand, just like we don't fully understand God, but we can penetrate into and understand and draw something from our scientific discovery. And so that synergy that lies behind the Church's long-standing support of scientific discovery, right? And Stephen Barr, who introduced me, has an excellent talk that he gives, pointing out the support the Church has had over millennia of science, and talking about different Catholic practicing Catholics who are influential sciences over the years. And on the Society of Catholic Sciences website, there's a list of over 80 of these important scientists, some of whom were Catholic priests. Now, despite this, there is this powerful counter-narrative claim, and Dr. Barr mentioned that in the introductory remarks to the conference here, that the truths of science in some way conflict with the truths of faith, that scientific discovery is gradually upending and has a stranglehold on Catholic beliefs and superstition. It's upending that stranglehold, that Catholic beliefs and superstition once had on the popular imagination, and it's sort of chipping away at that, right? And nowhere, I think, is this more evident in the popular culture than in evolutionary biology, right? There's some understanding that as we understand more about evolution, according to many popularizers, that human beings are no longer this special thing made in the image and likeness of God. We're just some random lucky cosmic winner of a evolutionary accident, a twig on some distant branch of the evolutionary tree. Now, this view holds such force in the popular culture, right, that in his inaugural pontifical homily, Pope Benedict actually mentions evolution. He says, "We are not some causal and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed, each of us is loved, each of us is necessary." Now, there's a danger, I think, of taking this quote out of context rather than putting it in the context of all that Benedict has said. Because if you look at the statement, it almost sort of seems that there's this either-or thing here, right? We're a causal, meaningless product, or we're the result of the mind of God. But to read it in such a way is really to do violence to how Benedict sees evolution and creation, right? Rather, what Benedict was concerned about here in this statement, he's concerned about the implications of the atheistic philosophies that are inspired by evolutionary theory. Philosophies that attempt to reduce the human person to nothing more than this causal, meaningless product of evolution, right? And this is something that Benedict shares, a concern he shares with pontiffs before and pontiffs after him. You see this in the writings of John Paul II and so forth. When it comes to the science of evolution, though, Benedict explicitly does not view this as inherently incompatible with the Catholic faith. Right? And this is one of my favorite quotes from Benedict. It comes from a series of homilies he did before he was Pope in the 1980s. And this is a small book entitled In the Beginning, on the meaning of Genesis. And he says, "We cannot say creation or evolution as much as these things correspond to two different realities." He refers to the Genesis creation account does not, in fact, explain how human persons come to be, but rather what they are. Right? What does it mean to be human? To be made in the image and likeness of God, right? And vice versa, the theory of evolution seeks to understand and describe biological development, scientific developments, the physical body of man. To that extent, we are faced here with two complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities, right? So for Benedict, like an investigation of the biological connection that man might have with the other animals, or the other primates in particular, in no way diminishes what man is. Likewise, the fact that humans are the only earth creature that's fashioned in the divine image, we're infused with the gift of reason, such that we can discern the good and order in creation. He says that can enlighten and guide our scientific studies regarding the emergence of man. This synergy there, that I think is at the heart of that quote, is something that we see in the Catechism of the Catholic Church about how our human understanding is useful to pull out useful things from and meaning from our study of creation, right? So the Catechism says, our human understanding, which shares in the light of divine intellect, can understand what God tells us by means of his creation. Right? So what is God telling us by means of creation? It requires work to understand and to discern how does creation work? How does it operate? Right? Though not without great effort. Right? It's not an easy thing. You see millennia of scientists trying to understand what is going on in creation. How do organisms behave? What causes that behavior? What allows particles to do what they do? Forces of planets from the smallest scale to the largest scale. And then also he says, only in a spirit of humility and respect before the Creator and the work, or the Catechism says. And this is a key thing, I think, with evolutionary discussions when you're talking about evolution and understanding the Catholic meaning of creation is that spirit of humility, that how, as we usually end up with conflict when people hold to beliefs or believe that what they have is they're not open to new evidence, not interested in discussing things, and are settled sort of in their ways. So that humility that is, I think, at the root of being a good scholar is something that the Catechism talks about. Right? So the fact that the loving God has made a world that's intelligible bodes well for scientific inquiry, right? It's a promise, in a sense, that scientific inquiry, if pursued diligently and in a spirit of humility, and respect for the Creator and His work will reveal truths about the world that complement what has been revealed to us through Scripture regarding God, creation, and mankind, that they're not going to conflict, right? So for our purposes in this talk, it means an honest, competent investigation of the science of evolution done through the proper use of human reason, again, will lead us towards God rather than drag us down towards atheism. And that's a sort of perspective as a Catholic investigator in this science of evolution that sort of frames everything that that you should look at, right? And we should not be afraid to take on this task. So the more we understand evolution, it should not mean by the further we get from God, right? But unfortunately, there's a lot of people under that impression that the more you look into evolution, the further one gets away from God. The more we connect ourselves to these, we talked about, sort of human evolution, these pre-human hominids, the less divine we become, right? And or the less we are connected to the, a Catholic understanding of God. But our study of nature, though, I think reveals behind it, and Dr. Hayes was talking about there's a reason behind it, right? And Albert Einstein, although not a theist, right, he was correct when he remarked that the study of nature revealed such a superior reason that everything significant which has arisen out of human thought and arrangement is, in comparison with it, the merest empty reflection. There's a level of humility there, like recognizing that there's something greater than you out there that you're trying to comprehend as you look at evolutionary thought or look at the Creator. So, this reflection that we see here, imperfect as may, should spur us on towards worship of the real thing. It should orient us towards God, right? So, yet what should one do when the truths of science seem to conflict with the truths of faith, right? This is where humility, careful study and analysis, hard work, as well as sober philosophical reflection come to bear fruit, hopefully, right? Now, before delving into sort of the science of evolution, things I want to talk about related to that, it's useful to look at a couple of the protagonists in the Galileo affair, right? And the reason I want to do this is because they represent sort of attitudes that can hinder one's sort of investigation of science, and others that sort of reflect ways that we should approach this, right? So there's many examples of this in the Galileo affair of different perspectives that sort of lead to sort of more conflict than is necessary. But one of the most illustrative, though, and the one I'll start with, is to look at Pope Urban VIII's position on the heliocentric system, right? So Pope Urban thought that while Galileo's heliocentric model could be mathematically explain the movement of the heavens, he did not think it necessarily described what actually occurred, right? He said, because God could have made the world appear as Galileo had described it, while in fact, the earth sat immobile at the center. And so he sort of famously said, man cannot presume to know how the world really is, since God could have brought about the same effects in ways unimagined by humans. It's not proper to restrict God's omnipotence. Right? So with such a position, you can maintain the literal meaning of certain scriptural passages, right, that implied a stationary earth, and simultaneously give credence to the ability of Galileo's heliocentric system to accurately predict the movement of the heavens, right? But such a position really sounds a death knell for science. It's like, why continue to pursue scientific discovery if what we are investigating, what we're coming to, is simply deceiving us, right? It's not what really is out there. That God made it look one way, the earth is moving, even though the reality might be quite the opposite, right? This runs counter to the understanding that God has endowed humans with a reason capable of discerning the order in his creation. If what we discern doesn't necessarily correspond to that, then God could have done it any other way and made it appear to us that it worked this way. So how does this relate to evolutionary studies, right? So when looking at like the genetic connection between humans and other primates, right? there's certain things that we find, right? And I'm going to talk about one of those right now and then look at how that might relate to this, right? So what you find if you look at humans and other primates, you find these things called processed pseudogenes. Right? And what they are is it's a gene that has been transcribed to make a protein. But during that process, in some cases, the RNA from that gene, after it's been processed, gets inserted back into the genome somewhere else. Right? So it's a pseudogene. It's no longer has the ability to be transcribed or used. And this happens on occasion. If you look at the pseudogenes, the locations of them in different primates, you find that they're in a very specific pattern, right? If you look at, say, the first of the enolase one there, right? It's in the exact same location in humans, chimps, and gorillas in the genome. It's in the exact same spot. It's been reinserted there. And if you look at how much the sequence is altered, you can get an idea of how old it is, right? And it's thought to be about 11 million years old. Right? If you look at the one on the bottom, which is 36 million years old, based on the amount of change it has, right? It's found in all these other primates as well. So what you see with these processed pseudogenes is that they're found in a pattern that's consistent with the idea that they occurred in an evolutionary ancestor and were inherited by these primates through common descent, right? So the most parsimonious explanation of this data, to look at this empirically, would say, well, this seems to suggest, right, that it's good evidence that humans and other primates are related by common descent. This is exactly what you would expect if that's the case, right? But I mean, it's logically possible, right? And there are certain creationists who will make the argument that God just brought about the same effects in a way that's contrary to what is revealed by scientific discovery. What we see here, that he could have just inserted these processed pseudogenes in there and put them in at the exact same location at these places with the particular mutational pattern that makes it look that they are a certain age, and therefore this is just the way God has made it appear. This is not what actually happened, right? But such a view should be foreign to a Catholic understanding of the relationship between God and the only earthly creature made in his image. And if such a view is correct, really all of modern science tends to grind to a halt, as none of its knowledge has any foundation, necessary foundation in reality, right? From the Catholic perspective, right, it is necessary to wrestle with the science if one hopes to come to the truth of God's creation, right? And that's what the Catechism stresses. Our human understanding, which shares in the light of the divine intellect, can understand what God tells us by means of his creation. So if God is telling us something through creation, if he's revealing himself in creation, we should be able to, in an honest way, look at that creation and be able to extract something from that rather than saying, well, we know it's deceiving us. This is what it might be telling us, but we know it's telling us. It must be telling us something else because it's not agreeing with what we think it should be telling us, right? I want to look at one other protagonist in the Galileo affair and sort of his attitude and perspective and how you sort of reconcile differences between sort of particularly Catholic interpretations of the Bible and scientific discovery, right? And this second protagonist is Cardinal Bellarmine, right? So in judging how to reconcile the scientific data from Galileo with the biblical text, right? This is, he had stated to Galileo this: I say that if there were a true demonstration that the sun is at the center of the world and the earth is in the third heaven, and that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun, then one would have to proceed with great care and explain the scriptures that appear contrary, and say rather that we do not understand them than what is demonstrated is false, right? But I will not believe that there is such a demonstration until it is shown to me. So there's two things here. First, Bellarmine certainly recognizes that the truths of science and the truths of faith flow from the same truth, namely the triune God, right? And if that's the case, therefore they cannot contradict, right? And thus, any apparent conflict between the two is just that. It's apparent. Right? The conflict is either the result that we don't understand fully the science, right? Or we don't fully understand the meaning of the scriptural text, right? At the end, though, he says, I will not believe that there is such a demonstration, the science, until it's shown to me, right? So this opens an interesting question. What is the level of scientific certainty, right, that Bellarmine is asking for, or that anybody is asking for, to know that, okay, maybe we need to reinterpret the scripture? What is that level of scientific certainty? And that in Galileo's time, there was quite a debate over that, because the scientific certainty wasn't at the level it is now, for example, right? What is the level that you need to proceed with great care then and say, okay, we need now to proceed with great care to figure out and explain scriptures that appear contrary, right? You could ask the question, was Bellarmine asking too much of Galileo before he would proceed with great caution and care? The idea, though, is that with scientific theories, you're never going to have absolute certainty, right? So scientific theories are not established with certainty, right? But serve as reasonable explanations of the natural world, right? And they're well supported by the evidence. So what is the level of evidence that you would need to say, well, okay, well, at this point, we have to reinterpret what the scripture, we must somehow be not interpreting the scripture correctly, right? If certainty, though, is what one desires, scientific theories will always leave one lacking. And this is particularly true of evolutionary theories, given that evolution is largely a historical science, right? It also has, there are experiments you can do, and I'll talk about those, but it has a large context of it, a portion of it is a historical science, right? So because of this, making the case for any particular theory of evolution or evolutionary change is more analogous to, say, to like a lawyer attempting to assemble circumstantial evidence to convict a murder suspect, right? So assuming there's no surveillance camera there filming and showing exactly what happened, right, at the crime scene, the lawyer's left to assemble the evidence that you find at the crime scene, the suspect's house, the victim's house, and to try to assemble that into a coherent case that can establish the likelihood that the suspect did, in fact, commit the crime. Now, the lawyer can also, supplement this historical data that he's trying to reconstruct with lab data on blood samples and DNA, from hair and so forth. So there are, just like evolutionary scientists can use DNA comparisons and have lab experiments that they can do, supplement their historical data with. But even if the lawyer is able to assemble a range of converging evidence, absolute certainty is ruled out, right? The suspect could have been framed, or new evidence could emerge at a later date that could change the outcome of the trial. And this is why lawyers try to make a case beyond a reasonable doubt, right? And I would say evolutionary scientists face a similar, but albeit more formidable task when it comes to establishing theories of evolutionary change, right? So, a crime scene may be a few weeks, years old, right? The paleontologists are left to scour the fossil record of a crime scene that has sustained billions of years of damage, right? In order to make their case. Now, of course, there are lab experiments that you can do as well, and I'll talk about some of those later on in the talk, right? Developmental biologists can perform lab experiments where they manipulate developmental patterns to sort of posit how one species could have emerged from another group of evolutionary genetics. Geneticists can compare DNA sequences of the living and recently extinct forms of life. We can still get DNA. But most of the living organisms, you're not going to be able to do that. So you're looking at a very small window. But with that, one can then attempt to construct a coherent narrative, right? But even despite all that effort, right, there are many aspects of evolutionary history that will likely remain forever masked behind the veil of history, right? This is just the reality of a science that relies upon interpretations of age-old rocks and DNA comparisons that only involve a small minority of the organisms that have ever been on the planet, as Dr. Hayes was pointing out in his talk, right? Now, to be clear, this is not, I'm not saying this to dismiss, and to be clear, evolutionary science in general or any specific evolutionary scientific hypothesis, right? No, rather, it's a cautionary tale of what science and evolutionary science can do for you and what it can't do, right? So if one were to criticize and dismiss an evolutionary picture of natural history because it's incomplete or tentative, right? I would say to be consistent, one has to throw out and dismiss almost all scientific theories, right? If one thinks evolution should be able to demonstrate the sweep of evolutionary history in a manner by which you can demonstrate 2 + 2 is 4, one is asking something that's actually beyond the scope of a scientific theory. Science is not mathematical certainty. The question is rather, given the evidence we now have at our disposal, right, what scenario or what evolutionary theory best makes sense of it? Right? And that's the question that a Catholic must be asking, right? Rather than what scenario is more akin to one's philosophical preferences or one's preferences for some biblical interpretation, but what is the most rational, reasonable case given what we see from the science of evolution, right? Now, with this in mind, right, I'm going to switch, and I want to look at sort of 3 areas of evolution, evidence for evolution, right? And the reason I picked these 3 is because there's so many things you could talk about. I wanted to focus on things that relate to commonly held objections or commonly held misconceptions about what evolutionary theory can do and what it says, right? So the first issue has to do with a common claim that evolutionary processes of change, you often hear this, involve the loss of information or never the gain of new information, right? And if this is true, then evolution has a huge problem, right? So you look at a bacteria, it might have 4,000 genes. Modern humans have over 20,000. So there clearly has to be some increase in information, genetic information that's useful over time. How does that occur, right? And what are the processes by which that occurs, right? Without the ability to create new information, evolution is doomed to failure. The theory doesn't work, right? The problem, though, with the claim that evolution doesn't produce new information is, in a sense, flies in the face of the evidence, right? And that's where we're saying, looking at the evidence, what does the evidence empirically tell me? That should then allow you to make, as Dr. A said, that should inform your understanding of nature, right? So there's a lot of evidence showing, through gene duplications and rearrangements, you can get new genes and so forth. But one of the things that's been really interesting, and this is something that has changed a lot of thinking on evolution is in recent years, is that there is now evidence that you can get new proteins de novo, right? So this is getting a new gene rather than modifying the existing ones. You can take one gene, you make some mechanism where you get a duplication and then it modifies and you've got now 2 copies of that gene, one that does something slightly different, right? It was thought that most of genes would emerge this way, right? Well, there is now evidence that you can get de novo emergence of genes, right? So what does that mean? So if you look up here at this picture, what you see, my poor diagram here, that brown line there is meant to be a chromosome, right? And on that chromosome, there's 3 genes, right? And the genes are in blue, and that little arrow there in front of them is what's called the promoter region, and that's where you can turn the gene on, right? So this is a cartoon of the RNA polymerase machine that's going to bind to that little arrow, that promoter, and turn the gene on to make the RNA, and then eventually can be used to make the protein, right? So the genes are going to be used to make, we have 3 genes that can each make a protein, right? Now, in between the genes, you have this intergenic space there in brown where there is not a gene currently, right? And this space is used for a variety of different things. It's used for regulating, turning on and off genes, for structural reasons, to help protect genes, for helping to coil the genome in different ways. So there's a variety of different functions it has, but it's not where this polymerase is going to bind and turn on the gene. Right? Normally, the polymerase is just going to bind there at that start site. Right? Now, what would happen, though, if the polymerase just binds here? Right? You would think, and it does this, because these things are, there's just a stochastic nature of these things. They don't just, you get some sort of random binding of this polymerase. They will bind there, and it's going to read the DNA there, and you would say it's not a gene, right? So what are the odds? Most likely it's going to read it. It's not going to be useful. It's going to not be used to make a protein, right? Well, it turns out that on many occasions, it seems that just randomly binding in this intergenic space, you get new genes, de novo, that come out from non-coding regions. So rather than taking an existing gene and modifying it, you get a new gene appearing de novo, right? So what happens is, if you look at this figure, you can see there in blue, that's where the genes are. So those are the functioning genes. Right? That's genes that are currently, in the organism being used for something, right? The green areas are where the polymerase binds, right? So you can see, we found out there's this background level of polymerase binding. It doesn't just bind at the genes, it's something that binds at these other sites, right? And when it does, it will make RNA, but usually it doesn't necessarily have a function, right? But you have this background binding. It's almost like you're exploring different places to bind, right? Now, you also have in there, you can see these yellow lines, which are called open reading frames, right? And what that means is it has the sequence that if that region was transcribed into an RNA, it can then be actually made into a protein, right? And so what you can have is two things. You can see that area on the left where that arrow is right now. That's the place where the polymerase will bind, okay? And it's going to make an RNA, but it's not going to have an open reading frame. But if there's a mutation that generates an open reading frame there, you can have now the polymerase bind, makes the RNA, and you actually make a protein, right? From a piece of DNA that previously wasn't a coding. De novo, you get a gene that merges out of this dead space, right? Likewise, on the other side, you have these open reading frames in the other circle that are not transcribed, right? So they're not being used, but they're not a normal gene. You have a mutation now where the polymerase, can bind to this region. And if the polymerase binds there, you're going to make an RNA. It has an open reading frame that can be used to make a protein, right? And you would think, on average, most of the time, it's not going to be useful, right? This wouldn't be a major source of new genes because you're just transcribing DNA that doesn't have a specific sequence, hasn't evolved a sequence that's going to be associated with a protein, right? But it turns out, as you do these type of experiments and searches for this, you find, and this is from a recent paper, a review, you find that in organisms as diverse from yeast to humans, you find that you get new genes that actually have a function arising from these non-coding sequences, right? So it's also, you have a mechanism in place. Now, it's not that this is coming ex nihilo, out of nothing, right? There has to be a mechanism, a cell in place that does transcription and translation and so forth. So you have to have the machinery there for this. But there's a mechanism by which you can sample and produce new genes from scratch in a very quick manner and in a variety of different organisms. And this is sort of in its infancy, because 20 years ago when I was in grad school, nobody ever thought this was possible. Nobody even looked for these things, right? So this is something that's sort of emerging, a new way in which natural processes can produce new information over time, right? Now, the second issue, the second piece of evidence that I want to talk about has to do with people's understanding of evolutionary theory and what they're actually rejecting. So I think many people have an outdated understanding of evolutionary theory, an understanding of, say, Darwinian theory that has evolved quite a bit since Darwin, right? So for example, and there's many examples of this, but I'll just use one. So for example, Darwin believed in gradualism, right? That evolution proceeds by small, nearly imperceptible steps such that there should be, innumerable transition forms, right? So this is a quote from The Origin, a famous quote by Darwin I was reading. It said, "It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages." Right? So if that's your view, that evolution proceeds by very, very small steps, you can barely perceive them, right? The idea was that you should see, every sort of intermediary form in the fossil record. It should be, everything should be obviously connected, should be littered with that, right? And Darwin, for the most part, believed this. And he had some things where he thought that the pace might slow up and slow down or speed up. But for the most part, he was a committed sort of gradualist. But while he was, I say our current understanding of evolution has evolved quite significantly over the last 150 years, right? Very few scientists would hold such a similar gradualistic view that you can't have more significant transitions from A to B, rather than going from A to A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, up to 100 to get to B. That you can have some jumps, in a sense, right? Bigger jumps. Right? One key mechanism that seems to drive this more rapid change is what we call this theory of evo-devo, right? It's this evolutionary changes through developmental mutations. So you have large-scale changes from relatively small mutations, right? A lot of this work was initially done in the fruit fly, this is a common model organism. But what you have are genes that influence early development, right? So you think about an organism developing, one of the most important things that you have to do is figure out what's going to be the head, what's going to be the tail, what's going to be dorsal, what's going to be ventral, what's going to be right and left. Those things have to happen very, very early on during development. And then if you don't do that, you're not going to build the proper form. Then you have to decide, okay, what limb comes out here? What does that look like? How many digits? So you have all these decisions that are made early on in development. So if you have a mutation that affects early development, right, you can have a large-scale effect on the phenotype of the organism, right? And one of the most famous ones of these, and one of the first ones sort of examined, was this one called altobithorax in fruit flies. And it's you can see it says UBX there, that brown one. You can see, if you look at the arrow where it's normally expressed, it's expressed in the third portion of the thorax, which is where you usually have just a set of legs coming off, right? But if you have a mutation in that, then that causes that second segment, the purple one up there, right, to be replicated in the third segment. So instead of getting the segment 1, 2, and 3 of the thorax, you get basically segment 1, 2, and another 2, right? And so you end up with a fly that looks like this. It's got 2 sets of wings, right? So you can see you've got a small change genetically leading to a large phenotypic change. So there's no gradual intermediaries there. You go from A to B, right? So how might this work, right? So this isn't a particularly useful mutation for these flies to have, right? But there's some very interesting examples that you see where very small changes lead to major changes in the organism that are evolutionarily relevant, okay? So this is a paper that actually it came out 3 months ago, right? In this paper, they found a gain-of-function mutation. What that is a mutation, it's a dominant mutation that causes a new function, right, to emerge. Right? It's a relatively complex change. And this mutation is only a single base pair mutation. So it's not a radical mutation. We have to rearrange the genome. So it's a single base pair mutation. And what happens is you go from a fish fin that has these, you can see here on this side, that normally has these proximal radials and distal radials, and then the fins coming off them. So the cartoon here doesn't show the fins, the ray fins, but over on that side you can see those are the purple things going straight up, right? So this is a zebrafish, and that's the fin, right? The single change, the single mutation disrupts the development of the limb, or not disrupt, but alters the development of the limb, so you get something that looks like this now. You get 2 extra bones. You have the proximal radials, you have these intermedial radials, and then you have the distal ones, right? And the interesting thing is that they are fully integrated into the limb, right? So you see, those are bones. So in between bones, you have cartilage at the end of the bone, right? They have cartilage in the joints, right? They have attachments to muscles, right? So this is a fully functional limb, and those intermediate radials are the things that, evolutionarily, as in the tetrapod transition from the emergence of tetrapods from fish to tetrapod transition, that eventually give rise to the bones of the forelimb, in the radius and ulna of your arm. Right? And so those 2 bones, there's this latent ability of one mutation to switch back and forth between those 2 fully integrated forms. So there is this ability to make major changes relatively rapidly, evolutionarily, right? It's not this, certainly could be gradual changes, but there are more substantive changes that can occur and be integrated. And the reason is because this is, this focuses on the holistic nature of the organism, right? So the organism has the resources, in a sense, to go in multiple directions in the limb bud, depending on the environment, the genetic change, and so forth. So it's not, as deterministic, in a sense, as we might have thought, right, in early development. Another example of this, I don't want to stress this point too much, is the transition from a three-chambered heart to a four-chambered heart, right? There's another mutation, TBX5. It's another one of these genes that affect development. And I'll just point out very quickly, normally in a four-chambered heart, you have that expressed only in, you can see the expression is in blue, so all the way at the top on the far left. It's only expressed in the left ventricle, and that leads to a nice septum separating the right and left ventricle. And you can see in the wild type there, you can see LV and RV pointing out the right and left ventricle. Right? If you disrupt that gene, that disruption, either have it not expressed or you can express it in both the right and left ventricles, you don't get a septum there, right? And what you get is one ventricle, a third ventricle, you get a three-chambered heart, right? And it seems like by changing where and how this is expressed, you can get different versions of heart, a fourth-chambered heart, a three-chambered heart. Again, they're not fully four-chambered, but it is that you get a nice septum that starts to separate the right and left ventricles. So you have one gene that different changes in how it's turned on, its timing, its expression can lead to changes in significant changes in heart structure. Okay? Now, the last item to address I want to talk about is the experimental evidence that surrounds the origin of humans. All right? How do you, and this was one of the sticking points often for Catholics or Christians when they look at evolution. How do you reconcile physical continuity, evolutionary, with this ontological leap to human uniqueness? And that's something that Simon Conway Morris is going to address in the next talk, right? But I want to talk just briefly about three pieces of evidence that anybody that wants to sort of investigate this is going to have to incorporate, right? The first is just the fossil record, right? And so, just as a brief overview, I don't want to get into this too much. What does the fossil record suggest? Right? Anybody that wants to address human evolution has to explain the myriad intermediate hominid forms that are found in the temporal sequence that one would expect if the modern human body had indeed evolved from other hominids. Right? So if you look back 4 million years ago in Africa, you find at least 7 different species of the Australopithecines. Right? These are upright posture, but relatively small brain. If you look back 2 million years ago in Africa, you see a myriad number of forms that are in our own genus, Homo. Right? And if you look at this picture here, I think 2 things to take away from it. Right? One is that it's relatively, there's a lot of arrows that are dotted lines, there's question marks. I'm not really sure how all these fossil forms fit together, right? But the fact that you actually see them in a particular temporal sequence that would be consistent with what you would expect if humans evolved from other hominids is something that we have to take seriously if we want to integrate what science or creation is telling us, right? These are only, there's not a neat link, A goes to B goes to C, like the picture I had on the first slide where you see the ape gradually standing up. What you see is more of a rapid, a bushy tree, right? You have all these different hominids with different forms, like a radiation of forms, and over time, out of that emerges a hominid that looks like us. And more recently, you see multiple hominids that are very similar to us, Neanderthals, modern humans, Denisovans, that have large brains, upright posture, and small jaws. Right? In addition to that, you have the archaeological record, right? And this is a record that suggests that humans capable of symbolic rational thought have been around for at least 1,000 years, right? So prior to 100,000 years ago, artifacts that have a clearly symbolic nature seem to be lacking in the archaeological record. Dr. Bagel talked about one of these, he used this picture here from Blomberg's cave, but you have others, right? You have this jewelry over here. We have these shells that are hold out at the exact same point in all these different shells. You have sort of advanced hafting techniques where you have blades attached in a relatively complex way to wooden spears. So you have these things that you start to see 50 to 100,000 years ago, and you don't see them in just one place, right? You see them in different places in Africa and in the Levant, which suggests that modern humans must have emerged before that, before they spread out and started doing these in different places, right? More recently, you see even sort of unambiguous signs, I think, of symbolic thought, right? Particularly from 50,000 years to the present. So you see, in this case, you see, cave paintings, these three-dimensional, thought to be like maybe fertility gods or something like this. These representations here on the right, these cave paintings that you see, and just like the artifacts you see from 50 to 100,000 years, you find these all over the globe, right? Initially, you just found these in Europe, right? But you now have found these in Africa, and just recently, those two on the left are found in Indonesia, and they're dated to about 43,000 years ago, those cave paintings. And then you can see there's like a pig there, another animal there, and then they also had sort of half animal, half human ones. There's almost like a religious deity or something like that. So there's clear evidence of this. So you have this, any understanding of the emergence of humans must take into account and explain this deep history of humanity, a history that stretches back at least 100,000 years, and spans multiple continents. Okay? The final thing I want to mention, and we've already talked about, this has come up a couple times in the talk, is modern genetics and the idea that when modern humans left Africa, they clearly encountered other hominid species. When modern humans left Africa, over the past 100,000 years, there's probably been multiple ways, but they certainly had spread out roughly around 60 to 70,000 years ago. And they headed into the Levant. They encountered other hominid species, particularly Neanderthals. Right? And so that's sort of the boundary of the known boundary of the Neanderthal world there that modern humans would have encountered. And it's not clear how much culture was transmitted between humans and Neanderthals, but DNA sequence data from both groups has revealed that genetic information was transferred. So in fact, roughly 1% to 3% of the DNA from non-African modern humans is thought to be of Neanderthal origin. Right? So with these matings, most of the genes probably didn't maintained in the human gene pool, but some of them, probably ones that gave these early migrants some selective advantage, because Neanderthals had been here for about at least 200,000 years before humans got there. So they must have had some sort of advantage, selective advantage, and those genes may have given the humans that left Africa an advantage of this new environment, right? This leads to intriguing questions, such as whether Neanderthals are rational beings and therefore should be actually part of our human family and thought of as sort of theologically human, or Neanderthals a distant relative that lacked that rational spark, but they're similar enough biologically to lead to successful matings. Now, while these questions are maybe difficult to resolve or impossible to resolve, we cannot ignore the evolutionary evidence that strongly suggests overall that the human form has emerged through a complex biological process that involves the transitions through different types of hominids in Africa, right? The fossil intermediate forms, the genetic exchange with Neanderthals, the long history of symbolic artwork, jewelry, and complex tools, as well as the sharing of those genetic defects in specific genome locations I talked about earlier, can't easily be swept away without failing to understand what God tells us by means of his creation, as the Catechism says, right? But it's equally true, though, and I want to caution, that evolutionary account of the emergence of man's body cannot be used to easily sweep away the Catholic understanding of the human person. To paraphrase Benedict, can't get rid of what we are, right? The evolutionary origin of the human body does not necessitate doing away with the belief that humans are created in the image and likeness of God, that they're a unity of body and spirit, or the reality of original sin, that we have fallen and turned from God. And I stress, there's nothing in the science of human evolution that I've talked about here that demands such a rejection. None of those things force your hand. While the science of human evolution, it does point to the unity of the human race, it's not fine-grained enough to reveal the specifics regarding when the first humans emerged, those creatures that made in the image and likeness of God. While the archaeological record, as we talked about, can give us some guidance, we're pretty sure that they must have emerged, 100,000 years ago at least, right? It's not going to give us certainty. And in fact, the exact details likely remain beyond the reach of history, right? This situation is summed up very, very nicely, and I'll end with this, by Father Andrew Pinsent in an article that he wrote about original sin and human evolution. He says, humans, when they awoke to the capacity for abstract thought and moral decisions, however this happened, received also the gift of grace and various other divine gifts to know and love God as stewards of creation. Yet they freely chose to reject the love of God and so lost these gifts, their nature being stripped bare of grace. Their descendants who inherit human nature without these gifts suffer the effects mostly evident in a bent towards what is broadly acknowledged as evil. Whether or not one chooses to accept this account on moral, philosophical, or theological grounds, what can at least be said is that we are not compelled to reject it on scientific grounds, right? So clearly, significant questions remain. And we were talking about them this last night on the panel. How did the first humans emerge as a single couple, the proverbial Adam and Eve, or did they emerge as a population? What does that mean for original sin? And as we talk about, a lot of those things are not, are speculative. We're never going to be able to resolve those, right? But they are open questions that give scholars much to ponder, right? But there is nothing in the science of evolution that is inherently contradictory to the Catholic understanding of creation, to the Catholic understanding of man, or to the Catholic understanding of the Creator. And that is why Benedict can say that here we are faced with two complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities. So, thank you.